All right, looks like we are on the air. So how's it going, Ed?
Yeah, it's going great, thanks.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how to pronounce your last name?
Sure. So it's pronounced Yarborough, but you wouldn't be able to guess it from the spelling. So yeah, I'm a Vue.js developer. I'm on the core team. I'm main author of the Vue test utils, and I wrote a Voriaz before I started writing the Vue test utils.
Oh, that's awesome. So you've been kind of in the Vue.js community for a while, being a core contributor and working on this testing.
Yeah, so I wrote a Voriaz in January this year, and then I joined the team a few months ago, about 5 months ago now.
Cool, cool. And tell us about the new book then.
Yeah, so I'm writing a book, Testing Vue Applications. It's all about testing Vue applications, as the title suggests. I go I go through how to unit test components, how to unit test Vuex, Vue router, and how to write unit tests for mixins and filters as well.
Yeah, that's so important too. With any application out there is to definitely not forget the testing part. I think especially new developers, that's one thing that, especially even in school, you don't really learn it. It's kind of glossed over a lot. I mean, I think when I graduated with my computer science degree, and now this is dating myself a few years ago, yeah, I don't remember any like talk about testing at all. I mean, we did talk about agile methods and things like that. But it was all in all our classes and everything. It was all manual testing. It's only when I started approaching the professional career that I started seeing it more often. So so why don't we just test everything manually? What's the benefit of, let's say automated testing?
So I think the main benefit is time. Manually testing your applications takes a long time. So you have to open up the browser, check that your feature works correctly. Maybe you have 3 or 4 or 5 steps to get your application into the state to check that your feature works correctly. And when you've got a large application with hundreds of features, you'll be spending potentially hours each release to check that all of your features are working correctly. So when you've got automated tests, all you have to do is run a command and your tests will run maybe in a few minutes, probably less. And you'll know for certain that there's no problems with your application.
Yeah, I mean that seems that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, be able to manually test it, especially if you're going back and doing regression testing for your app. That's really important. And I mean, does it, when you are approaching testing, I think one thing that I see, at least in my jobs, I've worked at a number of companies, some smaller companies, some larger ones, in some development focus. And sometimes testing is more of an afterthought, I think, in some of these companies. So how do I convince my management that testing is important? Because honestly, some of our legacy products, it would probably take months to go back and add the test cases that it should have in there. Instead, we kind of rely on QA and the developers themselves just to like manually test everything.
Yeah, so it's difficult when you've already written the application. I think writing tests after you've written the code is a long, difficult process, and it's hard to make the case sometimes to your manager that you should do that. But I think it's easier to make the case that when you write new features, you follow test-driven development. There are quite a few studies that show that test-driven development reduces the bugs by 40 to 60% in your code. So I think if you told your manager that the next feature you wrote was going to have 40 to 60% less bugs if you wrote it following a TDD style, it would be quite easy to convince them to let you write in TDD.
Now, test-driven development, that's where you literally, as the name suggests, you're writing the test case, unit test, end-to-end test first, and then you're going in and the way I've been taught to do it, and actually I'm not a TDD expert by any means, is that once you write the test, you go back and you just do the minimal amount you can in the code for the test to pass. And then you write more test. And then you write just enough to make the next test pass, and so on and so forth while you build it. Is that kind of the way that you would approach it?
Yeah, that was a very succinct explanation. So they call it red-green refactor, which means you write a failing test, you check that it's failing for the right reason. That way you know that if it fails in the future, it is failing because there's a problem with your code. The next thing you do is you make it pass by writing the code that's needed to make the test pass. And like you said, the minimum amount of code possible, because then you know that you've written the smallest amount of code that you can to get the functionality you want out of your application. And then the final stage is refactor. So it's probably pretty horrendous looking code if you've just written the minimum amount possible. So it's always good to go back and extract any duplicated logic and make some of the functions and variables a bit easier to read.
And how long does that add to like your testing or to your coding altogether? I mean, if let's say you're on a sprint and you are trying to get it done before a certain time date, and you decide to go to your manager and say, hey, we're going to do this new test-driven development on this feature enhancement. We know we don't have the resources to go back and do it for the whole existing code base, but could you say, well, maybe this will add 20% more time or 30% more time in the front, but we're going to save it in the back end because we're not going to have to fix bugs in the future?
Yeah, so I think it's hard to put a percentage on it. And when a team's new to testing, it can take a bit longer because you have to get used to some of the techniques required to test some of the more complicated parts of an application. But when the team is used to testing, I think that it maybe adds 10% to the development time, but it saves a lot of time in debugging and any other problems that might come up with your code in the future.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, definitely. I think that's really important. You know, one thing our challenge with our team too, and some of the teams I've worked on, is it's easy to get some of the low-hanging fruit tests, but then when you have to mock some data from a back-end server, or you're dealing with kind of complicated components that talk to other things, then all of a sudden your test cases become a little bit more difficult to write, and then it could take a little bit longer. But I guess that's just a learning curve of knowing what libraries to use and trying to figure out what you should use to write your test cases properly and
Yeah.
mock everything correctly.
And I would say that testing does have diminishing returns. So if you're striving to get 100% code coverage in your tests, you're going to be spending a lot of time mocking something that might not be worth mocking. So while I follow TDD, I don't follow it to the book. Sometimes you just have to accept that it's untestable. You might, in trying to write a mock, you're almost writing another component of the same complexity inside your test.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, so you should realize when you're testing not to spend 5 hours mocking some complicated thing out. Maybe you just have to realize that part won't be able to test, or if it will, you'll have to test it in your QA environment or your staging environment first.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there are a lot of nuances to testing and TDD in general, which I try and cover in my book.
So going back to the book, so I've written a book, and I know that the process is long. It takes many hours, and it's a lot of work. And honestly, sometimes when you go online, some people are really positive about people making books. Other people are like, you should just, everybody should self-publish their books because, it's you can make more money in the long run. I mean, what was your deciding factor to write a book on testing? I mean, you're kind of already the expert in this industry in Vue.js testing. And was it just to kind of share the knowledge, or a little bit of prestige, or do you have a background in freelancing, or?
So I'd never thought about writing a book until I was contacted by Manning, and they basically asked if I wanted to. Originally, they asked if I wanted to write a chapter in a book, and after speaking with them, they asked me if I wanted to write an entire book on testing Vue applications. And I thought about it. I thought about the lack of resources that there were on testing Vue applications, and the need for a definitive book on testing Vue, and that's why I accepted and decided to write the book with Manning.
Did you ever think about self-publishing at any point?
No.
Yeah, that definitely, once you become self-publishing, I think people make it out to be easier than it really is, because at that point you're just basically running a business and you're having to market it and do everything else. I mean, yeah, you can just throw it up on. I know there's a couple sites that cater towards technical books that you can just throw stuff up on and just put your price on there, but it usually takes more from that if you want it to be successful and do
Yeah, I
well.
mean, I'm not, like you said, I can write, and I'm an expert in Vue and testing Vue applications, but I'm not a marketer. So I think, yeah, I think you Manning given me the opportunity to write a book and not to have to worry about any of the marketing or the sales or the rest of the business, and they
Yeah.
can distribute it and get it out to as many people as possible.
Yeah, exactly. And I think they do a pretty good job of that. I think some of it is bared on us, the writers, to get it out too, but I think they do an okay job too of getting the word out. So I know one thing that that I really like too about Manning is that they really have a focus on quality, which I haven't seen as much on my other. My last book, I think it was it was good quality, but they didn't have the level of what Manning brings to just make sure that really that we're giving the top information. It's really well written. It makes understanding. There's a whole philosophy behind how you write a book and how you show examples. And I think that Manning really tries to strive for that. So it makes really high quality books, which I think is something that you don't think about if you were just self-publishing. You wouldn't know all these kind of things that they bring to the table.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we have weekly meetings with our editors who go over our writing and tell us where we could improve and what things we could add that would make the book better. And then we have reviews every third of the way through the book, which is really useful as well.
Yeah, that's kind of opening the kimono a little bit, showing everybody that's listening or watching that that's what we go through. I know one thing that Manning does really well was the MQR, or minimal qualified reader. So what would you say what type of reader would you like for this book, or what is your MQR?
So my MQR, my minimally qualified reader, would need to know HTML, basic CSS, and basic JavaScript with a bit of ES6. So we use ES6 syntax in the book, but any complicated concepts like importing or promises are explained, and then there's a link to resources for the reader to learn more about them. So the minimally qualified reader would need to know HTML, CSS, and a little bit of JavaScript.
And they really don't even need to know Vue.js, do they?
They don't even need to know Vue.js. No, I explain as much as everything that they need to know about it as we work through the book.
That's really cool. Now, is your examples? I was looking at it yesterday, your book, and awesome, by the way, really well written, really great graphics. Did you see when you were writing it? Did you use the Vue CLI for your examples, or were they just? I think I saw mostly they were, right?
So I used the Vue CLI to originally bootstrap the project, and then I edited it. So the Vue CLI at the moment uses Karma as the test runner, but in the book we use Jest as the test runner.
When is that change going to be made to the kind of the Vue CLI scaffolding, so it uses, or will it you'll be able to select Jest instead of Karma?
Yeah, so I've actually got a pull request in at the moment.
Oh, cool.
Hopefully soon. It's been in there for a couple of months now, but yeah, hopefully soon.
Because this is the official from Evan, the official testing way that he is kind of you guys are blessing for the rest of us to go with.
Yeah, so we decided that Jest is by far the most user-friendly test framework. It's got everything out of the box. It has mocks, it has stubs, it runs JS DOM, which is a sort of JavaScript browser environment. It really does everything, and it's one of the fastest test runners as well for Vue components.
So that's cool. So yeah, I can't wait to see that pull request get pulled in, and then new applications using Jest going forward. So what was your? I guess this is more of a general question. What is your general approach to testing a Vue.js application? I know the book covers a lot between unit tests and end to end, and how would you answer that?
So as I said earlier, I follow TDD. So I write unit tests first that test the components. Once I finish the component, I'll write a snapshot test. I'm not sure if you're aware of snapshot tests, Eric.
I don't know, Ed.
No. So a snapshot test takes a snapshot of your component markup. So it renders a component, saves the rendered markup, and then compares against that rendered markup every time you make changes to that component. So say I've written a component, I've added all my styles, it looks perfect. I save a snapshot test. A few months later, I go back to my code and I accidentally delete a prop or a class from that component. The snapshot test will compare it against the previously saved version and warn me that it's changed and show me the diff. So that way you can catch any accidental deletions of classes or props or text or anything in your component. And then once I've got a snapshot test written, I'll write an end-to-end test for the core functionality where you're integrating multiple components.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I know you go deep into that inside the book of how you do that snapshot testing. And then what are component contracts?
So component contracts are concepts that it's a way of understanding what you should test in a component. So unit testing is difficult. It's hard to know what you should test and what you shouldn't, and what functionality you're looking for when you write a test. So component contracts are the idea that a component offers a contract to the rest of your application. When you use a component, you expect that it performs a certain functionality if you pass it certain props or if you use it in a certain way. So the idea of a component contract is that you think about what this contract is, what the component is expected to do, and then you write unit tests based around that. So you might have a component that displays a modal if you pass a prop display modal. That's the component contract. It's a contract that says if you pass this prop display modal, the component will display the modal.
Interesting. Yeah, I know that. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense there to do that. I know that inside Vue.js you can have props, and you can actually do prop validation in it inside just Vue.js without any testing code, and then it kind of emits warnings in your console. I mean, but obviously, it probably makes a lot more sense to write a whole test case around your props that you're using, what you expect.
Yeah, it's a difficult decision actually when you should test props and when you shouldn't, because you could test every single prop, but if you've got a large application, you're going to have hundreds of props, and maintaining hundreds of unit tests based around props that could change in the future is just incredibly difficult to maintain. So I think you have to be careful about what you do test and what you don't. Generally, I test props if they're dynamically generated. So if I pass a prop to another component that maybe has the index, so say I have a list of items and I want to pass a prop that says item name equals item, and then the index of the item 1, item 2, item 3. I'll write a test for that. But for static props, I think snapshot tests normally catch any potential bugs where you don't pass the props.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I know also when you're doing testing in general, you don't want to create tests that test the framework itself, I guess. But you want to.
Yeah, exactly. You don't want to test the framework. You don't want to test the library. That code's already been tested with hundreds of unit tests. You want to test the logic inside the component that you've written. And yeah, I go over that concept a lot in the book.
Yeah, so I think someone that's new to testing could get confused on when to test. They're like, well, should I test this special functionality? I mean, the framework's supposed to do it this way, but we really want to focus on this logic that we wrote ourselves. I can see that is interesting. I think now, is there some? I saw there was a section on style. Should you test style? Is that? Can you explain a little bit more about that?
So once again, it's difficult to know when you should test style and when you shouldn't. So I follow the same rule as when I test props. I tend to test styles that are dynamically generated. Maybe you have a progress bar and its width as a percent equals to the state of the progress bar. So I'd test that. I'd test that the progress bar had width 60% when the progress bar component had a state of 60% completed. But for general styles, especially when you're adding them with the classes, I think that it's very difficult to test that. And ultimately, you need to test it manually. When you style components, you need to check that they look correct at some point. So I think the best approach to testing styles is to use snapshot tests. Like I said earlier, you'll write your component, add your classes, check that it looks correct in the browser, add a snapshot test, and then you don't have to look at the component again until you restyle it. Or if your snapshot test changes, you can check then to see that nothing's broken in your style from the change you made that broke the snapshot test.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I know that styles change so much that every time a style change, your whole test would break if you do that. And I know also in some frame, I haven't looked at Jest in particular, but I know if you, depending on what selectors you use, if you're using like class selectors in your test cases, then if the class changes, then all of a sudden your test case breaks. But
yeah, so you've got to look out for that as well.
So it depends on how you select what you're doing. How Jest, I guess you just do any, it's just like jQuery selectors, any type of ID, div, whatever you want.
Yeah, so if you use Vue test utils, you can pass it any CSS selector. And like you said, if you're using class selectors, the test can become brittle. Classes are liable to change, but sometimes you can't get around that. And ultimately, Vue components, they output a render function that generates markup. So using a selector, in a way, is still testing that markup. So I think that sometimes it's fine to use class selectors in your tests.
Yeah, I know I've talked to a few people about how to do that, and I've heard of all sorts of different strategies on how to do different selections for your tests. Some people like create their own special class names to put on certain things that they want to test that never change, or have certain IDs, or
Yeah, so I think those are all valid tactics. But from my experience, once you've written the component, the classes aren't that likely to change. And if they do, you have to update your tests. But adding IDs and attributes specifically so that you can test the components seems like a more effort than it's worth to me.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. All right, man. Well, thanks, Ed. I think we've gotten through pretty much everything I wanted to ask you. I mean, this was kind of just a quick overview for people on testing, just kind of some simple basics to start off with. But I think if you want to learn more, and I know if you want to learn more, you don't even have to be a Vue.js developer. If you just want to learn more about just good testing in general, then I definitely recommend everybody pick up this book. And I'll put a link in the description below of where people can buy it. So where can people contact you, Ed?
So you can reach me on Twitter. You can get me on GitHub. If you make an issue in Vue test utils, I'll likely respond to you within a couple of days. You can find me on Medium as well.
That's awesome. The Vue.js, are you guys looking for contributors for Vue.js utils?
Yeah, definitely. So if anybody wants to make a PR, we review and merge PRs every day from lots of members of the community. So come on over. There's quite a few features that we want to add, and we could always do with more contributors.
That's awesome. And do you guys have like easy contributor, like guideline, like beginner tags for new people, or is it
good for first timers tags? We do, but we don't have any that are active at the moment.
Yeah, that's always nice to see, especially for people that are kind of nervous about getting into open source, and to see those tags, know that they can kind of jump in there. Although I've definitely seen, this is a little side tangent, but I've seen sometimes those beginner tags on some projects. You'll get some guys say, oh, I'll take care of this, and then literally it'll be crickets for weeks.
Yeah.
Like, well, I guess, and then someone else will come in and say, I got this, and then they'll be crickets for another week or two. Oh, but like, yeah, mostly that's a good thing. All right, man. Thanks, Ed.
Cool. Thanks, Eric. Good talking to you.
Good talking to you.